wow, just so overwhelmed just by the Spirit of God. You know, as I look out and I see the faces of you, you know, fellow Asian Americans and a mix of a little bit of something else. You know, what I see is transformation. What I see is transformation. The fact that God takes people and He changes them and He uses them to be agents for His kingdom. So Casey, I don't know what you did, but I don't know if you knew, but you just gave the platform to like a bunch of ex-gang members and ex-convicts, all right? So we just heard from Sebastian. So you can be seated. Thank you for the wonderful worship. My name is Tony, and I really want to give you just a picture of how God has transformed my life and how He is transforming the nations. My family came from Laos, you know, back in the early 80s, and they escaped, you know, war and whatnot. And I know a lot of you can really identify with what it's like to actually leave your country, right, and come to a new country and not speak English, right, and grow up in very hard neighborhoods, you know, otherwise known as ghettos. And so for my family, we came from Laos, and you know, we lived in many places all over the United States. My brother and I, we kept getting into a lot of trouble, you know, because everywhere we went in these Asian communities, right, in these Lao communities, it was the same thing. There was gang banging, right? There was like gambling, and there was drinking, and there was Buddhist temples. So we grew up Buddhist, and there's a table in one of the exhibition. In the exhibition hall, and there's a brochure, and there's a picture of a young novice monk, right? He's bald and he's wearing an orange robe. I mean, that was me. That was me, you know, when I was 10, when I was 11, and when I was 13. I actually went into like the temple and became a monk several times, just because my mom said, "You're so bad, you have so much sin, you need to make more merit," you know? I needed a lot of karma. But we did, so we got into all kinds of trouble, and I ended up just you know, bringing a lot of heartache and pain to my parents and to my mom. And she tried everything. I mean, we moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. We even lived in like the Midwest in some small little towns. I even lived in El Monte, okay? We even lived here, people. Lived in this little apartment complex, all Mexicans, and we were the only Asians, and every night you'd hear the Mexican music, boom, 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 you know. Lived everywhere. You know, and moving from place to place, obviously, it did not change the problem, because the problem was an inward one, right? It was an inward situation. And so I was on, I don't know, I think I'm related to Sebastian, you know, because he reminds me a lot of myself. Maybe I'm his long-lost little brother. But I mean, I was on house arrest. I was locked up in juvenile hall for a few months. And then finally, I got out of juvenile hall, and my mom says, Tony, like if you love me, okay? If you love me, you'll get away from your friends for a while, and you'll move back to LA. Okay, so we were on the East Coast at this time. And mom was so desperate, because she knew that my cousins were actually going to church, and she said maybe this church thing will work. And so I said, of course, Mom, I love you. I'll do anything for you, you know. And I was 14, I was 15 at the time, and so my mom, you know, she sent me to LA to get away from gangs. All right. So, and it was here that God just grabbed a hold of. God grabbed my heart. And you see, I had never gone to school, right? I missed out on school, like all of junior high. You know, I got expelled from 8th grade and 9th grade. I hardly even went. And so I was going to this church with my cousins, right? And there was this one couple, this white couple, all right? This white couple, just this normal white couple from the Midwest, and they had a heart and they had a love for inner city Asian knuckleheads, okay? And so just like what Sebastian talked about, these people, they actually came into our world. They came into my context. And they didn't judge me, but they loved me for who I was. And they showed me that there was freedom in Jesus. And so I was actually in La Puente, and I was sitting in their house, and I was listening to this testimony from a man who was like involved with the mafia, all right? And I saw Jesus in him. I saw that God had transformed him. And I was sitting there, I was 15, right? I had never heard about Jesus in my entire life. And I was sitting there, I was listening to this message, and I just kept thinking, this is so incredible. This is so amazing. And I was mesmerized by this message. And that night I went home, and I couldn't sleep. And so I got on my knees, right? I was 15. I got on my knees, and I just said, God, I know you're real. I know I'm messed up. Come into my heart, change my life. Good night. And I just went to sleep, and I just felt this peace. And, the very next day, I feel like God is going to do something amazing. God is going to do something big. And so, I went to school where I, smoked a little weed or something, and came home, right? And then finally, my aunt she says, "Hey, Tony, hey, pack your bags. You're going to be moving to San Diego." And so I was like, "Okay, cool. With who?" Well, the pastor and the man who gave his testimony the other night, they actually want to take you and a few other ex-gang members to San Diego and start a church. It's like, okay, I'm cool, I'm down, And so God, this really began my faith journey. And I actually, this white couple, right? Understand, people, I grew up around Asian people, and the only white people I knew, right, was like my probation officer. It was like the school principal. And I saw that they just had a love, And to this day, I lived with them since I was 14, 15, and to this day, I consider them my parents. And so I saw what God had done, and God transformed me. And and when they started asking me about the future, I never actually thought about the future, because I never thought I'd finish high school. And miraculously, I did, just through this homeschool program with some other knuckleheads. And we finished. And then she asked me very distinctly, they asked me, so what do you want to do? And I thought about it, and this just made perfect sense, right? Romans 10:12. I said, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But how could they call unless they believe? How could they believe unless they hear? And how could they hear unless someone preaches? And how could someone preach unless they are sent, right, people? And I said, I know that there are millions of people around the world, especially in Laos, where my parents are from, that have never heard of Jesus. And I said, I don't care about anything else. God has changed me, and it makes sense, right, to give everything for him. It just makes sense. And I look back, this reminds me so much of when Jesus called Peter, right? Jesus was doing his thing, and he did not have his disciples yet, his homeboys. And so when he called Peter, Peter was doing his thing. He was washing his nets. And then Jesus called him out, right? Jesus said, Peter, cast your net into the deep end of the lake. And Peter says, yes, Lord, we've been fishing all night, but we haven't caught anything. But because you say so, we'll do it. And of course, we know the story, right? God delivers, and he does this amazing thing in Peter's life. And the first thing that Peter does, right? The first thing that he does is he goes sells the fish and he makes lots of money. No, he gets on his knees, okay? And he says, go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. Go away from me, Lord. And I can just see Jesus, right? He says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. From now on, you're going to be fishers of men. From now on, I'm going to use you to do the great and wondrous things, right? So I think in every story, when you become captivated by who God is, when you become so mesmerized, right, by his value and his worth, when you see his glory, there's nothing you can do except abandon everything. And it makes sense. See, Peter left everything and he followed Jesus, right? I mean, he knew Jesus. He knew about Jesus. but he hadn't yet abandoned his actual career, his actual job, his way of life. And he spent that whole 3 years just following Jesus and sitting under him. But it made perfect sense, right? Because when you're so captivated by something, it makes sense. And I said, I don't care about anything. I want to go to places where people have never heard about Jesus. And so for the last 4 years, my wife and I, we've been living in the country of Laos. And God has allowed us to see some amazing things. I have 2 daughters, 3 and 1. And my 3-year-old, I've been teaching her how to do CPR, okay? So sometimes I lay on the ground, and then I would play dead, right? And she would come over. She said, hey, daddy. And then she would listen. She would put her ear to my chest, and she would listen to my heart. And then she would start doing CPR. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And go back down and listen. And she said, get up, daddy, you're alive now, okay? I believe that's a great picture of what it means to be close to God, to close to the Father, right? You're so close that you hear his heartbeat, Like you hear God's heartbeat. And this whole conference is about hearing God's heartbeat. And what is it, people? It's he changes people to redeem a lost world, right? He takes what is so unlikely and he uses them to become light in dark places, right? And his heart, of course, his heart is for the guy across the street, but more importantly, his heart is for the nations. And we're not talking about, countries here. We're talking about peoples and ethnicities. And in Laos, there's tons of peoples and ethnicities, and there's one in particular. I want to share a story with you about a people group called the Lao Bu people, okay? So that's not their real name. After I'm done, I want you to come up to me and I want you to ask me, Tony, what is that group, the real name? And I will tell you. I want you to know, because I want you to pray, but I can't say it because this is being recorded, okay? And Laos is a closed country, it's a place where you can actually do Christian work openly. And there's this group, 150,000 Lao Bu people, right? In this one part of Laos. They've never had a church, never had the gospel, never had any messengers to them. Okay, so for 2,000 years, these people have been worshiping spirits and demons. They don't even speak the Lao language. They speak a different language. And so and God has kind of put them on our hearts. And we want to see things happen. And so for centuries, they have never known Jesus. There's a man who is of Lao Bu ethnicity, right? He's from the Lao Bu tribe. And I'll just call him Tong, okay? Tong. About 2.5 years ago, Tong had a 3-year-old daughter and she died, right? So she died. And the Lao Bu people live in a remote area. They're so far out. They're a lot of them are uneducated. They're very poor. They're actually marginalized. And so, of course, young people in a poor country die all the time. But for the Lao Bu people, they believe that spirits, they believe in spirits and they worship demons. And so the spirits made his daughter sick, and then the spirits took her away. And he actually became depressed and just angry, and he said that spirits would torment him, right? He finally became completely not himself. He was no longer in control of his body or his mind, and he said he was demon possessed. He was just like that guy in Mark chapter 5, right? The demoniac, when Jesus cast the demon out, he was just like that guy. He says he was living in the jungle. Like he was living in a jungle right above the village. And at night, he would come in and he would steal food from the villagers. And it got so bad that the villagers actually got together and they built a cage, right? They got wood and bamboo and they built a cage, and they took Tong and they put him in this cage. And they actually took rope, right? And they tied his ankles together and they tied his wrists together. And the witch doctors came, the shamans came, and they tried to do their thing. They tried to do their ceremony or incantation, and nothing worked. Nothing worked. And then Tong tells me, okay? So Tong tells me, he said, a friend from a different village comes and says to him, I've heard about Jesus. I'm going to try to plead he said the word, I'm going to try to beg to Jesus for you. And Tong says, yes, please. And so Tong himself, he prays, right? So Tong, he says, he's on his knees and he begins to pray, right? He says, God, I believe in you. And as he prays, he says the ropes on his wrists began to fall off. And then where's Sebastian? Is he not here? He's gone. You know what he said at the end? Satu. I'm serious, that's what he said. And so he said after that he was in his right mind. He came out of that cage and he went to the elders and the leaders in that village and told them that Jesus had changed him. And they saw that he was changed. They saw that he was a different man. And Tong actually went and he went to a district town, right, to find another Christian. And that Christian later instructed him to take all his idols and get rid of it. And so he went back to his house. He took his spirit shelf. He took his charms, his necklaces, his little statues, the little demon worship stuff. And he had a little bonfire, okay? So he burned it. And he says ever since that day, him and his family has never been bothered by the demons and they've never been sick before. And so just about 4 months ago, right, it took us a 2-hour drive and a 4-hour boat ride. This little boat, 4 hours going, and we get to this village, and he tells me this story, right? And he says, there's so many people who want to come and believe in Jesus because they want to be healed and they want me to pray for them. And we say, why aren't you doing this? Just tell them. He said, well, I thought only the Christian pastors can do that, He says, no, can tell people and pray for them. Okay, and then he calls 2 weeks later and he says, over 15 families just came to believe in Jesus. Praise God, right? And so now, for the first time in history, we have a church amongst the Lao Bu people. Isn't that amazing? And of course, I believe that God is not content with just one church, but He wants to see all the peoples come to Christ. And if you're, struggling with, okay, how has God used me? How has God wired me? It's like, come on, if God can take, a simple farmer, right, like Tong, and use him for the kingdom, if He can take a stubborn fisherman, right, like Peter, and use him for the, if God can take an Asian gangbanger, right, and send him to Laos and use him for the kingdom, then God can definitely use you. God can use you in whatever capacity you have. I was talking to my brothers, just hearing their testimonies. Some brothers here who just came to Christ. And it's just amazing, right? The fact that God is a God of transformation and He's looking to redeem a lost world. And He allows us to be a part of what He's doing. As we go, we're transformed, and He uses us to be agents of transformation as we go.